morning for Brother Herschel Beard to keep the Beard family in your prayers. Justin, what song do you have for us to start us out with?
We're going to start with number 29.
29, you're ready to read them.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then prayer will lead us. Close prayer, open prayer, that was being dismissed to classes.
Absolutely. Our first song will be 29, and before we sing that, we'll have Book Bar 717. That'll be our second song tonight. Our invitation song. Give you a second to get that part.
What's the first one?
Number 29.
Grab your Bibles and turn to Romans chapter 14 again tonight, please. Romans chapter 14. We've been looking at what, you come down just a little bit for me, Neely. We've been looking at, yeah, that's about right, thank you. We've been looking in chapter 14 and 15 for a couple of weeks at what, to me at least, in the book of Romans may prove to be one of the most challenging texts for all of us, and that's the fact that we have responsibility in our relationships with each other, and particularly per the instructions of chapters 14 and 15 when we are at different levels of spiritual maturity or understanding about issues that are not matters of salvation and how we're to relate to and deal with each other in those situations. And to go ahead and break the ice, it isn't the way that we normally, naturally, humanly tend to deal with each other. We tend to kind of break ourselves into camps or to keep people at arm's length or at a distance or regard them to be faithful or unfaithful based on their agreement with all the things that we've come to understand wherever we are on the spiritual maturity continuum. And yet Paul begins the discussion about our relationship to each other by telling us to accept those whose faith is weak without quarreling over disputable matters. Now, we didn't say much about that initial statement because probably we were anxious to talk about a lot of other things in this text, but not only, we spoke a little bit about what disputable matters are, but what does it mean when he admonishes or really commands, if you want to use that strong a language, us to accept each other without quarreling over disputable matters? Does that mean that we can't engage each other in conversation about things that we don't understand alike? No, we ought to engage. In fact, we must engage one another. That our relationship to each other demands that we do that. But there's a lot of difference between engaging in a conversation and quarreling, isn't there? Or arguing, or bickering, or a lot of other words that we could use. And what he's telling us here is he begins the discussion by saying that our attitude toward each other is fundamentally important. Now remember that all of this is based on what we started in chapter 12, living the life of a living sacrifice, presenting our lives or our bodies as a living sacrifice. Hence, it's not normal, it's not natural. You see in every facet of society, of human interaction, that we tend to migrate toward people who think like we think and away from people who don't think the way we think or understand things the way we understand things. And while that might not have great ramifications politically or socially or economically, it surely does religiously. Because the instructions we receive farther down in the chapter is that we're to treat each other, to accept each other as Christ has accepted us. And to be really honest, that wasn't on the basis of us having everything figured out or us understanding everything as we should, right? We certainly did not at that point, and we certainly even at this point do not in our spiritual life or our understanding of God's will. But accept one another except one whose faith is weak without quarreling over disputable matters. And then he uses the illustration of eating certain foods or not eating certain foods and observing certain holidays and not observing certain holidays, which leads us to understand that we're talking about a church in Rome that at this point in history is battling or dealing with the contentions that exist between Jews and Gentiles, right? Now he just uses those examples. I'm sure he could have used many others, just like we could use many others. While it's not very much or very frequently true that we argue or dispute about food and what's appropriate and what's not, or even holidays, very much. We do a little about that. But neither of those are really what we would call hot button topics of conflict or controversy for the church today. However, the principles in back of them are universally true for all things relative to the will of God. All things relative to the will of God. Now, we came down and we've talked, we've done a lot of talking, and I'm appreciative of that, but let's jump down to verse 13, where he says, therefore, and therefore is, since we're all going to give an account for ourselves before God, and we aren't fit to be the judge of someone else's servant, it's before his own master, he says, that a servant stands or falls. And in the context of God, he'll stand because God's strong enough to make him stand. Therefore, let's stop passing judgment on each other. Instead, make up your mind not to put a stumbling block or an obstacle in the way of a brother or sister. Now, let's talk about that stumbling block in the way of a brother or sister for a minute before we move on toward the end of the chapter. What is a stumbling block? And give me an example of how that would fit with this context. What is a stumbling block? Anything that would, that's right, anything that would tend to cause you to stumble and fall, right? Anything that would catch your toe, so to speak, and cause you to stumble and fall. In other words, don't be someone or manifest an attitude or an action that causes someone to stumble and fall. Rather, he says, build each other up. Give me an example of, and as non-controversial one as you can. I don't want us to start fighting over disputable matters in here tonight. How could I put a stumbling block in someone's way? How would I do? How can I do that? Okay, that would certainly be an opportunity to cause that person to digress into, well, things that are wrong rather than to follow God's will. What else? Christmas, yes. How could that be a stumbling block, Jeff?
Some people don't think, they think it's important that you not celebrate something that we don't know.
Yes.
And some people are pretty adamant about it.
Yes.
And despite how I feel about it, there's some people who might really get upset one way or the other on that issue. And so if I force it down somebody's throat.
Okay, now you're getting to what how would we do that? If we force it down someone's throat, how would we do that?
Send them a Christmas present.
That might. I hope it'd have the reverse effect, but it might.
Or ask them if they're going to give you one.
That might be worse, that's right. That might be the one. Well, here's my point. Because we have a freedom, okay, does that give us the unqualified right to exercise that freedom in any and every circumstance and situation? Most of you are saying no. Why not? I mean, if it's not wrong, then how could I be wrong in doing what's not wrong? If I demand my rights at the expense of a brother or sister, right? What I'm saying is me having what I want matters more to me, right, than the spiritual welfare of my brother or sister. So it's in the context of weak and strong, and he's speaking to the strong, bearing with and not disputing with those who are weak. It's not enforcing or demanding my rights or my freedoms as a Christian. In other words, for a Jew, let's use his illustration. For a Jew who's still hung up a little bit about certain kinds of food, or a Gentile who automatically associates food that's been involved or connected with an idol sacrifice, now that he's a Christian, just can't stand the thought of and believes it's a violation of God's will and sinful to even be associated with it. For me to invite him to my house and demand that he eat, or even set the example of eating before him with the intention of causing him to participate in something that he has a problem with, lacks faith regarding, is causing him to stumble rather than edifying him. Does that make sense? Jeff?
And I would say, you know, I mean, sometimes we excuse things because well, I didn't particularly think. Paul doesn't say that.
That's right.
He says, make up your mind not to put in something.
That's right.
Decide today, you're not going to do this.
That's right.
Diligent, think about what you're doing and how that impacts others.
And if we're going to do that, what do we have to set as the first priority? The other person's spiritual welfare above me exercising my freedoms or my rights. Yeah? And that's hard for an American. Even an American Christian, that's hard. That's difficult. To forego a right for someone else's sake. For someone else's sake. Now, how far does that go? I mean, where's the boundary for that? Okay. 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 Well, let me ask it this way. That's certainly true. That's certainly true. Let me ask it this way. Could I possess an attitude that was so cynical, let's say, critical, let's say, that I put people in the situation of, well, rather than stumbling, what I did was grumbling? Does he say you are to forego your freedom for the sake of somebody's grumbling? No, not unless it's stumbling. And what's the difference between grumbling and stumbling? What's the difference? I can grumble about something with having absolutely no intention of participating. I can grumble for the primary purpose of giving you grief, right? Giving you grief. Stumbling, on the other hand, is me participating against my conscience, me doing something that's a violation of what I believe to be right, even if it's uneducated. You remember he said, there is no food of itself that's unclean. But to the one who thinks it is unclean, it is, because whatever is not of faith is sin, right? So stumbling is me participating in something against my conscience. Now, I'm not saying, and here's, I need to back up and qualify this just a little bit, that even grumbling, if it's due to immaturity and not just due to rebellion and divisiveness, if it's due to immaturity, then we need to be really patient about that as well, yeah? We need to be patient with that as well. Does that make sense? Okay, comments. Getting a lot of funny looks. I don't know whether that's just you're about to fall asleep or...
When he talks about, accept one another without, causing stumbling block or anything, a lot of it really has to go back to the ideas. You go into the room saying, I'm going to win.
Yes.
You go into the room and says, we're going to discuss, and we're still going to be brothers.
That's right.
That's a preparation that you can make on your own.
That's right. That's a mindset we have to bring to the situation.
It's not easy.
Yes.
Our anger, our selfishness will kick in a lot of times.
Yes.
And we'll say things that you think later, why did I say that?
Yes.
But if you understand that we're all God's children, all been forgiven of our sins, we all have His blood covering us, and we got the grace of God on us, then I'm not going to be near as demanding
Yes.
that you see my way no matter what, no matter how many times I get you over here that Bible.
The less it's about me all the time.
That's right.
The less it's about me all the time. Which is why he keeps going back to Jesus as our example. Jesus didn't demand his rights, right? I mean, when he was being beaten and crucified, when he was arrested, what did he have the right to do, the authority to do? Anything he chose. He's God. Anything he chose. What did he do? Was led, Isaiah says, like a lamb silent before his shearers. That's what he chose to do. When he looked at that crowd of angry people and said, Father, forgive them, what was that all about? Was that the expression of how I, as a human being, feel like I've been treated unfairly and unjustly and I'm going to have my pound of flesh? No, it was just the opposite. It was their needs above mine. Their needs above mine. And that is a mindset. That is something that requires maturity on our part. That is the position of the spiritually stronger brother. Because not through our own achievement, but through our maturity into following Christ. Following Christ.
I think the thing with this particular passage that requires some clarification in my mind is the difference between an immature believer and one that is just being
Rebellious.
intentionally
Yeah.
ignorant and rebellious.
Yes.
And the difference between someone that just hasn't spent the time reading and understanding as opposed to the person that has essentially read Spark Notes and is just using what little that they have
Yeah.
cherry-picked for their own self-fulfillment, for their own self-righteousness.
Yeah. Look what I know.
Yes.
Look what I understand. Yeah, and you know, that too requires a level of patience on our part and love on our part, because even when we're faced with trying to make that decision, and like a lot of other principles, it's really hard to put it down in print and draw lines around it and say, okay, if you do it 3 times, then you're hard-headed and rebellious now. No, you know, that's not the line, right? We know that's not the line. But really, to me, okay, and I'm just going to share my own experience for me receiving and giving both ways. One of the big tests to determine that issue right there is how readily I'm willing to listen to and engage in a constructive biblical study or conversation about that. In other words, am I open to the possibility that I'm the one that needs to grow up, or have I determined in my mind that I'm going to have my way or else? You know, I'm going to come out of this argument looking good, like I'm the stronger party. Well, the truth is that makes me the weaker party, right? That makes me the weaker one. But you're exactly right. Jeff?
Well, you know, since you use the term, one support with strong faith and
Yeah.
the stronger party, I think it's interesting that back in verse 1, Paul says, except the one whose faith is weak.
Yep.
You know what he could have said? He said, because your faith is strong, except the one whose faith
Yeah.
is weak. He didn't say that.
Yeah.
And I think that's extremely important.
Yes.
Because, why? Because Jesus himself said, if you had the faith that as much as a mustard seed,
Yeah.
you could say this mountain, get it more. So what's he saying? He's saying all of our faith
Every one of us.
is pretty weak.
Yep.
So it's kind of the pot calling the kettle black. You know, when you start there,
Yes.
you start pointing your finger at somebody else and saying, well, you're doing this wrong, right? You know,
Well, certainly nobody that I'm aware of and have encountered in my lifetime that I'm aware of would classify themselves voluntarily as, well, I'm the weak-faithed. We all think we're the strong-faithed one in our position regardless, right? What determines whether we're really a strong or a weak, to use that illustration, and I get your point exactly, is how closely aligned we are to the will of God. That's what determines, because, well, let's just take the matter of eating food, right? Is it by the time the church comes along that the new covenant's been instituted? Is it an issue one way or the other about food? Are you closer to God or further from God? Are you glorifying God or disappointing God by eating or not eating, either way? No, food's a non-issue. It's a non-issue. Non-issue. That's the mature position. That's what God says. However, there are several other principles that come into play. One of them is, am I going to force my understanding of God's will, mature though it may be, on someone else against their conscience? Or even further, am I gonna by my attitude put an obstacle in their path, or am I gonna pave the way every way I possibly can, make every concession I can to help, rather than to sit in judgment on, as he began verse 13. Don't stop passing judgment. Instead, don't put a stumbling block. So he tied those together there. Jim Patrick, I can see you want to say something.
Is that apparent?
Yes, to me anyway.
Well, I was just kind of contemplating that and thinking that a lot of times part of the problem is the attitude we have behind it. You know, if we do have a mature look on an issue, is that we want to throw that issue out there to where that it can be brought up, and then I can tell you how immature you are.
Right.
And that you need to get your Bible more, or whatever it may be, and that's to glorify myself and cause you to stumble.
Yes.
Warning us about causing others to stumble, because when we stumble, it has an impact on us in our Christian life that can lead to a lot of places.
That's right.
And
Dangerous places.
and if our goal is to, and I've always looked at stumbling blocks as something that someone struggles with that I don't, but yet I make it visible, or I bring the issue up,
Right.
or I put it in front of them just to watch,
Yeah.
you know, or whatever it may be. But there's no good intention in that. There's no love for your brother in that. And at the end of the day, it's a me thing, and we're warned about me things continuously.
That's
in
right.
the Bible.
That's exactly right. And that's really what this discussion comes down to. When he says, make up your mind, don't do this, what he's saying is, recognize who you are in relation to Christ. You recognize that me wants to do it one way, but Jesus sets the example for us to be someone entirely different than that.
And how much love we have for other people should trump any need we have to be right, or that we have to be a show-off, or anything.
You know, I mean, let's just use the physical illustration of putting something in somebody's way that's deliberately designed to cause them to fall, to stumble. Who would do that on purpose? You know? Now, I mean, in the spiritual realm, in our attitudes and those things, it happens all the time. But I'm saying, for anybody in here, if when we're leaving this evening, and it would be true of any person here, if when we're leaving and about to go home and we're parting ways and walking out the building, someone saw that a child had left something laying in the middle of the sidewalk that no one was looking down to observe, how would we deal with that? Would we gather up 2 or 3 buddies and say, hey, watch this, he's fixing to fall flat on his face, and laugh about it? No, we wouldn't do that. No. We'd say, hey, hang on a second. Hang on a second, let me get this out of your way. This is danger. This is a potential problem. This is a potential problem. So it's all about posturing ourselves in our attitude, in our mindset, in our words, in every way, so that we're looking out for the welfare of our brother more than poking our chest out at what I know and what I can do and what I have the right to do. Let me give you an example from my childhood. My dad's dead, and this is a long, old story that's gone away, so it doesn't affect anybody at this point. When I was really, really young, and since Jeff brought up the Christmas thing, I'm going to use part of that. There was a lady in the congregation, and it was a very small congregation. That was characteristic. My dad planted congregations, and when they got big enough to have a preacher that they could support or partially support, Dad went somewhere and started another congregation. It was kind of his ministry, his work. But in this particular situation, there was a lady in the congregation there, a Christian sister, who made the observation at some point during class, and the truth is it was more than an observation. She kind of put her foot down and just made a declarative statement about how wrong it was and how sinful it was and how inappropriate for the preacher and his family to have a Christmas tree in their home. And you know, I thought about that, and when I was 8 or 10, probably all the way to through my teenage years. I really was angry at the way Dad chose to handle that situation, because the way Dad chose to handle the situation is we never had a Christmas tree. We never had one. I mean, until Paul and I got married and that's the first Christmas tree I'd had. And I'll be honest with you, I nursed a little bit of an angry attitude about that for a long time. That's just not fair. It's not fair. But I've come to understand it took a lot more maturity and a lot more interest on my dad's part to do what he did than to have stood up and said, you know, I really don't care how you feel about it. It's none of your business. I'll do what I want. I admire him for what he did. Now, do I think that was an absolute? No, we can argue that point. But I admire his intentions and the way he handled that situation, because he was far more concerned about the impact that was going to have than he was about whether we had a tree in our house or not at Christmas time. And it turns out it wasn't really that big a deal anyway, you know, Christmas tree or not. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Yeah, well, within a year or two, she had one again pretty quick. Yeah, she did. I wasn't going to tell that part of the story. That makes her look bad, and I'm just going to leave that alone. That's between her and the Lord. Yes, sir. Right. Easter, that's right. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It absolutely is. And it's one that we ought to take serious in terms of us. And of course, you know, we can decide, or we can think, or we can assume a lot of things about that. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who that's a deliberate decision on their part. In other words, that's all I'm willing to invest. That's as far as I'm willing to go, you know. There probably are some of those folks who just don't know because that's the way they grew up or understood or whatever. So I guess all I would say to that, I agree with you 100%. We've just got to figure a way to engage that some way the best we can.
That's a good time to reach out.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Okay, anything else on that before we move on? Well, he continues on to chapter 15. Well, let me say one more thing. Here's kind of another little odd statement. Let me see here. Well, let's just read, beginning in verse 15. If your brother or sister is distressed because of what you eat, then you're no longer acting according to love. Do not by your eating destroy someone for whom Christ died. Therefore, do not let what you know is good be spoken of as evil. What does that statement mean? Do not allow what you know is good to be spoken of as evil. What does that mean? Does that mean that if somebody wants to talk about how wrong it is to eat, that you shut them up and say, I don't want to hear what you got to say about this? Don't let them say that? No, look at the context. The context is, do not by your eating destroy someone for who Christ died. Therefore, do not let what you know is good be spoken of as evil. If I force my will on you, right? Or I force my conscience on you, demand my rights, and it causes you to violate your conscience, or even to be weakened or distressed, it says, then not only am I not acting according to love, I'm using a good thing to accomplish an evil purpose. Yeah? Right? I'm using what's perfectly right, good, in a way that becomes detrimental, wrong, evil, negative, destructive for someone else. That's what he means when he says, don't use your freedoms in a way that they become an evil for somebody else. Now, you think about that, that's a pretty big principle. That's a pretty big principle. That's a pretty comprehensive principle. Because what that basically says is the attitude that says, I'll do whatever I want to do, what I do is my business, not yours, has no place. It has no place among us. It has no place among us. In fact, what my actions do or what impact they have on others is very much everybody's business, right? Very much everybody's business, because that's the whole point of it. Come down to chapter 15 real quick. We who are strong then ought to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Now, particularly that part about not pleasing ourselves explains and articulates what we've been saying all night. In our interactions with each other on every level, we would do ourselves and our brothers and sisters a great service to consider in advance who it is we're trying to honor and glorify and help by this interaction or this conversation. And if we go into it, as Johnny said a moment ago, with the attitude of I'm going to be right, I'm going to have my way, we would be better not to enter the conversation at all. We would be better not to interact at all. Because that's evil, that's wrong, that's negative, that's not following Christ's example. That's not living the life of a living sacrifice. But if we engage on the commitment that I'm after your welfare more than my own, your spiritual health and growth more than my own, then all of these things that we've been talking about in particular instances, they address themselves. They address themselves. Does he say something in verse 1 of chapter 15 that's different from what he says in chapter? I don't mean contradictory to, I mean in addition to. Listen again, verse 14, or verse 1 of chapter 14 says, except the one whose faith is weak, without quarreling over disputable matters. Then he comes to verse 1 of chapter 15, so we who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak and not please ourselves. Does that lay any additional responsibility on us besides accepting one another in chapter 14? Is there anything additional there? I'm not trying to trip you up, I promise. I'm sorry.
It says not to please ourselves.
Well, what does he mean when he says just prior to that statement, we who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak? Now in chapter 14, he said, except someone whose faith is weak, without quarreling over disputable matter. Is there a difference, or is it the same thing? Accepting someone whose faith is weak, or bearing with the failings of someone who is weak?
It just means that one of us has to give, it needs to be the stronger one. And, the weaker brother or sister that doesn't understand that issue, they're not the ones that's expected to, I guess the stronger brother's the one that's expected to give that up for the sake of it.
To give ground. Have you ever gotten the idea, well, maybe not say it that way, have you ever yourself, let's say it that way, found that you possess an attitude of seemingly being eager to pounce on someone who does something that's not, it's almost like you're looking for that? You ever, maybe you don't, but I've sure known that to be true. Let's say it that way. Yeah. Kind of seeking the opportunity to pounce, right? To jump on. That's the opposite of bearing with the failings of. That's the opposite, Joe.
Jimmy and I have seen that, unfortunately, but it's almost as somebody is the gatekeeper.
That's right.
For lack of a better word, to say, hey, well, I've got it all together, and I'm watching.
That's right.
The minute they get out of line, and I'm going to have to straighten it out. It's proactive negativity in a way, because they just,
That's a good way to say it. Rather than having decided in advance, I'm going to do whatever I can to help, it's almost as if we've decided in advance, I'm going to do whatever I can to point out your shortcomings and make you feel small as quickly as I can. Right?
And many times it's justified by saying, I'm protecting
Yes.
the integrity of the church.
Yes. And there's no question, Charlie, that's all of our intent. It's just that in the matter of dealing with human relationships, we have to accept the fact that none of us are perfect models of that, and that it took grace to forgive me or you or us or whoever, and it's going to take grace in me dealing with them to help that process. And I liken this to my grandchildren from I guess 4 years old is the youngest one now, all the way up to 12. All of my grandkids fall in that slot, which is a fairly wide range in one way. But let me tell you that my attitude toward those kids, even though sometimes their behavior may repeatedly frustrate me, disappoint me, I can tell you one thing is almost absolutely universally true. I never am looking for an opportunity to scold them. I'm always looking for a way not to if I can. And it doesn't hurt them for me not to. In other words, I'm always, if I'm going to make an error as a grandpa in judgment, it's going to be on the side of patience, it seems, rather than, and that may not have always been true with my kids, but it's that way now with my grandkids. And that's a silly little human illustration of the way, what he's trying to say to us here in chapter 15. Not looking for the opportunity to scold, not looking for the opportunity to pounce, looking for every way possible without compromising the integrity of God's word in the church to help that person. And by the way, even when someone does or says something that's just plain, overtly, clearly wrong, we still have the choice about how we're going to deal with that, right? How we're going to engage that. Is it going to be in public in front of everybody and call them out to make them look small, or is it going to be in a private situation based on our relationship of loving each other and work through that? See, Jeff?
Well, that was, you just used the word relationship with your granddaughter.
That's right.
You've got a relationship.
That's right.
And so you try to encourage them to grow.
That's right.
And you try to weaken them.
And that's not a one-time thing.
With somebody who's coming to the church and, you know, and I obviously know he's doing wrong. But do I have a relationship with him such that I can
Help rather than hurt.
help rather than hurt?
Yes. Yes.
I can go up there and say, hey,
Yeah.
you're messing up.
Yeah.
You need to straighten up.
Yeah. Yep.
And I've heard that from people before, you know.
And that choice has a great deal of impact on the outcome, right? It does. It does with us.
The first choice ought to be to develop a relationship with that person.
Yes. Yes. Well, I'll put it this way. My wife and kids can say things to me that a stranger doesn't have the right to say to me. You know, I'm just because of a relationship. No less true one time or the other, just the fact that that relationship changes the whole situation, whole dynamic. You had something?
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
More than a statement. What about, which is something that I think we come across quite often, but what's the difference in the situation as far as like when the perceived weaker brother has an issue with something, but then proceeds to talk about how sinful everyone is, that doesn't look at that issue the way they do?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, that seems like a different situation than what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Because they're on the offense now.
Exactly.
As
Well,
opposed to-
they're regarding themselves to be the stronger brother and need to instruct the everybody else. So yeah. Let me say it this way. I have discovered through failure and through a lot of means that I've been far more effective in relating to somebody and helping myself or somebody helping me. From a position of a person trying to help me rather than someone standing up and stomping their foot and demanding you're going to do it this way because it's the right way or else. I hate to say it, and I'm not proud of it, but I think most of us in our human nature possess a little bit of the thing, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, that whole kind of thing. I think we have a little bit of that in us all. So it's all a matter of the relationship. Let me say it this way. There are people who I have a strong enough relationship with that I can speak very plainly, very clearly to, not mean, not hatefully, but very clearly, very plainly. There are others where our relationship is tenuous or young enough that we need to be far more delicate and careful in how we say what we say, right? And there's not a guidebook for that. That's human relationships 101. That's what that is. But yeah, even that has to be addressed rather than, let me say it a different way and then I get you, Joe, I promise. The only way I can understand Scripture to declare that it would be appropriate, okay, for me to act out in public call-out mode would be someone who had the determined, deliberate intention of dividing the church and doing damage to the integrity of the church. In other words, it calls for a bit of discernment on our part to determine whether someone's motives are innocent, immature, weak, lacking knowledge, or whether it's someone who's come in for the express purpose of splitting the church if they can. The response is different in those two situations. The difference between rebellion and immaturity. I'll say it that way. That's the best I got. That's the best I got. Now, Joe, I'm sorry, I've held you off.
Therein lies the real wisdom, and I'm not single-liver opinionated, and that's the ability to discern basically who I'm speaking with.
Yes.
No measure of response. And too many times we're instinctively fire.
When anger gets involved in a conversation or in an interaction, things can spin out of control real fast.
So we've got to pause and basically allow ourselves to have
Yes.
a conscious thought about, situation, what it is, and who it is, etc. It's not easy. I'm not painting that picture easy. In fact, it's incredibly hard.
No, and I mean, that's one of the things that makes us look at Jesus, and when it says in Scripture, he knew their hearts. That makes us want to say, man, I wish I could know that. But the truth is, we really don't, that's not true either. That's not ours. That's not our place to know that. All we can discern by is actions and attitudes, physical manifestations of things. We can't look at someone's heart, which means we better be very careful. Be very careful. Tread lightly as much as possible. Okay. Let's wrap it up. Verse 7, accept one another then, just as Christ accepted you, in order to bring praise to God. There it is right there. That's the concluding remarks right here. Accept each other as Christ accepted you in order to bring praise to God. And then he goes back and uses Jesus as an example again. He said that's what Jesus did when he opened his arms to the Gentiles, so that they might glorify God for his mercy. See, the point of it all, we've pointed this out before, is God's glory. God's glory. God's glory, over and over and over again, honoring God, glorifying God. May the God of peace, verse 13, or the God of hope, fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope or confidence by the power of the Holy Spirit. Kind of leaves you with the impression that we ought to proceed not only with caution, but with the wisdom that only God can give us. and be sure it's his glory that we're seeking and not ours, right? Be sure it's his, not ours. Okay, anything before we stop there for tonight? Because we're not going to come back to 14 and 15 again unless y'all just want to. It's really, really bad. I'm going to move on. I think we've ridden a lot of principles out of that text in the last 3 weeks. Anything at all? Well, then mark, if you would, verse 14 of chapter 15, and we'll kind of begin what I refer to as the wind down, the personal wind down of the book, where Paul sends his greetings and instructions to the church. And it's not that that's not important. It's just not profoundly doctrinal. We can learn a lot from it, just not aimed at teaching us doctrine. But we'll pick up with that, Lord willing, next time. JD, you're up, brother.
Talk loud enough. Can y'all hear me? I can hear myself, so I guess so.
I can hear you fine.
Mighty sweet of you. Make this short and sweet, heavy on the short and pretty light on the sweet. We'll do the best I can. I was sitting there yesterday evening. I got home late, but I was like, what am I going to talk about? And so I got on my Bible app and found the verse from, I think it's 2 days ago, was the verse of the day, and it was 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6. We're going to start in the beginning of chapter 9 and read through verse 11, and then I just got 2 points I want to hit, and I got a little story, and then that'll be it. Starting chapter 9, verse 1, if you want to follow along with 2 Corinthians. There's no need for me to write to you. Well, first I'll give y'all a little what's been happening and such like that. The Corinthians are being urged to follow through on a previous commitment they've been giving generously and such to the new Christians. So Paul's talking why giving in this way matters so much. Giving is what our main topic is tonight, as you'll figure out. There's no need for me to write to you about the service to the Lord's people, for I know your eagerness to help, and I've been boasting about it to the Macedonians, telling them that since last year you and Achaia were ready to give, and your enthusiasm has stirred most of them to action. But I'm sending the brothers in order that our boasting about you in this manner should not prove hollow, but that you may be ready, as I said you would be. For if any Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to say anything about you, would be ashamed of having been so confident. So I thought it necessary to urge you, brothers, to visit you in advance and finish the arrangements for the generous gift you have promised. Then it will be ready as a generous gift, not as one grudgingly given. That's a good point right there. Remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver, and God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. As it is written, they have freely scattered their gifts to the poor, their righteousness endures forever. Now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed, and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way, so that you can be generous on every occasion, and through us your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. One of the first points I take away from reading that text in the order we did is right there into verse 5. Then it will be ready as a generous gift, not as one grudgingly given. And that reminded me so many times, and I go, I see the opportunity. It's presented itself. Well, goodness, if I do that, I'm going to lose this money. I'm going to lose this time. What's in it for me? And it's so selfish to think that way, but I find myself doing that quite often. I believe everybody has at some point in their life, and it's an attitude check, if anything, of to what am I owed anything in the first place? What I have is not mine to begin with; it's God's. It should never feel that way, and that. Reading that, just basically reminding the Corinthians, make sure you're giving out of the goodness of your heart, not just
compulsively like he had mentioned. And then number 6, I always love reading this verse because I personally, know people. There's plenty of people out there, wealthy people. There's all kinds of people, but I know wealthy people who are wealthy both with money and also they're just wealthy with a great attitude because they give, and you can see in their life they give so much and the Lord blesses them. And that's exactly what verse 6 says to me. Remember, who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. And he tells us God has blessed us abundantly so that we can do those things and give cheerfully like he tells us. And I love it how he tells us, he blesses us with this, and however much, in the end, what you give is what you get. And I think is a big point that he's making there. And I think that's something we also need to keep in mind. Don't give assuming we'll get, of course, because what's the point in giving if you're doing it out of selfish ambition? But anyway, that was just really, I saw that, and I know I struggle with it from time to time. And to close, I'll just tell y'all a little story. I was leaving, and we'll just clarify before I start this, giving, I count that, whether you're giving a monetary gift or helping, you're giving your time. Giving is, it's a broad spectrum out there, and there's plenty of other places in the Bible to talk about giving. But like I said, I saw this, but I was leaving Kennard one day, headed to the house, and it was already pretty late, and I was like, I saw the guy pulled over on the side of the older man. His trailer had smoke come up from underneath his axles, and I was like, golly, I know I need to do it. So I went past him like a half mile, and it just ate me up. So in a not so great attitude, I turned around, and I went over there, and he was half deaf and had drool coming out. I couldn't believe he was driving. I was like, man. But anyway, he'd probably been driving like that for 20 miles. He didn't even know what was going on probably. And so I stopped there and talked to him, yelled at him, and told him, I said, well, there's a gas station right up the road. Just pull up there and we'll figure it out before one of us gets hit. So we pulled up there, and I was like, best case scenario, I can, rig it together. He came from Louisiana. He had a long trip back home. And so I didn't know if he was going to want to fix it right or what, but I was going to give him his options once I had assessed the damage. Well, of course, being my luck, I was already wanting to go home. I'd already spent 30 minutes. Well, to do it right, it was going to be one of those, well, come stay at my house tonight. We'll wake up in the morning and drive all over the place, chase parts. And so he ended up calling the guy he worked for. He told him, nope. He said, I don't think you're loaded heavy enough. Don't worry about it. Chain that axle up and go to the house. And that was news to me. I was so excited. I was like, well, that's good. Now I can, and shouldn't have felt like that. I'm here for him. I'm not here for me. I should have put my wants and needs aside. But I was getting ready to clean up my tools and stuff and getting ready to pack up and head home. A guy comes, taps me on the shoulder. And I turn around, and it's a guy who's owed me money for about 3 months. And I was like, well, look at there. If I would have just kept on driving, he knew it was not one of those, oh, he owes me money. It was just, we're both busy, just whenever you can pay me. But I thought as I was driving away, I was like, that had to be divine intervention, because that was God saying, this is what you get with that bad attitude. I'm going to show you, you just don't lose sight. And he sure did. And I drove home with a smile on my face and with a little bit of regret for the way that I felt. But that was just a story. And I have plenty of other stories like that, but that was the most recent one. And I think about that. I try to think about that every time an opportunity presents itself. Not because I may get paid every time I do something like that, but for the sheer fact of there's somebody bigger and better in charge of everything, whether we believe it or not. And so if anyone has a need tonight, please come forward as we stand and sing.